Ever wonder what happens when bad prioritization meets bad communication meets a lack of understanding of game mechanics by the devs meets an absence of quality assurance in a game? Well, today I'm going to show you an example in the form of Lynuga in Everquest. Although this is a really niche quest NPC in an already pretty small game, it's a really good checklist of what not to do when trying to tweak an established game mechanic. Okay, first off, what's Lynuga? This is a spawned NPC in Inithul's swamp that lets you do a quest called Lynuga's Gem Collection, which is basically you hand her a ruby and get one of three items. The one people are really going for is Ivandir's Hoop, and the reason behind that is for quote-unquote competitive open-world boss races. As you can see here, it's a clicky that gives you 6 charges for 1200 damage, or double that if using your discipline as a Shadow Knight. So it's pretty good. And as it developed on the Teak time-locked progression server, everyone was required to get one to use whenever there was some competition afoot. So this brings us to the start of our story. There was this really strange post on the bug forums about the item, which has just been an accepted part of the game for years now. A dev separated it out as part of another post, which is why it looks a little strange here. Let me read some of the post for y'all. The second one is Lynuga. Lynuga is a troll in Inithul's swamp that you originally gave rubies to in hopes of having her give you an Ivandir's hoop. You originally had to kind of gamble to get this hoop because she would give you a bunch of junk items in between. Usually it was around 40 to 60 rubies to get a single hoop, unless you were lucky. Now, as long as you have the junk items on you, Lynuga will always give you an Ivandir's hoop. Right, so historically you'd need to give Lynuga a bunch of rubies before you get a hoop, as it's saying there. But what this guy is pointing out is that due to some change in the meantime, you could basically get the other two items she dispenses in your inventory, and then you'd be guaranteed to get a hoop if you gave her another ruby due to game mechanics with lore items and quest rewards. Fine. So I guess that's not really intended, but the first issue here is one of prioritization. This issue affected only a very small number of players, namely those who were trying to race for open world boss spawns, so maybe a couple hundred or so at the most. Further, it affected them in a, let's call it, very fair way. This was basically common knowledge and open for everyone to get in a basically free way, as the Teak server had already had massive plat inflation by that point due to incompetent GMs trying to fix another bug, which they had done by sending out millions of platinum created out of thin air into the economy, and on top of that, a likely plat dupe. So it's not like anyone wasn't able to partake. It was essentially just like going to get your world buffs before raids, an annoyance at worst. Second, usually how player submitted bugs work is there's this whole process of putting them on the forum, and then they fight with all the other bugs for player likes, which leads to someone on Daybreak's side to confirm it's actually a bug, then in their queue for fixing. So as you can see here, even months later, this topic only has 4 reactions, 3 of which were negative. It basically bypassed all of that and skipped to the top of the queue. I'm not going to say this developer, who frankly I've never heard of before this happened, plays in or was influenced by someone in one of the 2 guilds who was going after open world on the regular and didn't want to take the time to go refill their hoop after every battle, but that's really the only logical explanation for the way and speed in which this was prioritized. Imagine trying to be competitive in WoW and being too lazy to go get world buffs before raids. And how, might you ask, did we figure out it skipped to the top of the queue? Was there an announcement that the quest would no longer be accessible? Well, no, the devs were completely silent on that front. But the players figured it out that Lynuga had been perma-killed because despite how many hours we sat there trying to spawn her, nothing happened. I guess we're far removed now from the newfound age of openness and engagement with the players. So while the original state wasn't unfair, this temporary state was completely unfair. I'm not going to QQ in this video because it's a bit beside the point, but many players had stockpiled hoops on alt accounts. You can only have one of this item on any character due to game mechanics, but there's nothing to prevent you from trading for another one once you've used its charges. So race after race, you had a few players pulling out a seemingly infinite supply of hoops to burn, while others were effectively banned from using them. This was basically the only thing in this whole episode that is even kind of a borderline exploit by the players by shamelessly bypassing the intended lore mechanic and a nonverbal but clear intent by the devs that this item shouldn't be in the game as it was. All right, so finally there was a patch coming up, and wouldn't you know it, there was zero communication about what had been done in the patch notes. A few intrepid explorers had figured out from the test server that their quote unquote fix was to make other items Lynuga offered no longer lore, meaning you could have more than one of them on the same character. I guess the intent here was to make the rarity of getting the hoop back to its original state. However, there were two problems here, as the players quickly discovered. First, if you remember back, one of the other items was the Midnight Mallet, and this item has an instant clicky effect, namely a low-level slow. You can probably see the problem this is going to create, as now that you can get multiple of them, a tank can just load up, and no one in the raid would ever need to have to worry about getting aggro again. This. Second, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but a plat dupe was introduced. It's already been fixed, so don't freak out. But it was via one of the standard ways plat dupes arise in the game, so whoever was testing this should have been aware, but chose not to test for that one. Or I guess generously, it was a dupe that didn't work on the test server compile. Anyway, Lynuga got permakilled again within a few hours once the devs were alerted of the plat dupe, but I guess my main grievance with this step was that it didn't really accomplish anything. Like I mentioned earlier, plat was extremely inflated, and the fix employed was just aimed at making getting a hoop more expensive, so this whole nerf cycle wouldn't have even done anything, even if it hadn't had such problems that it needed to get taken down almost immediately. All that happened was that they introduced a really OP feature, namely that tanks could generate infinite aggro, and a plat dupe without solving any of the underlying issue, if there were one to begin with. Everyone would have still had to go get a hoop every open world fight had she not been taken down again. So now we're waiting another month for the next patch, and yeah, people are still just showing up with hoops on every contested fight. Now, these patch notes actually had a communication about the issue, which is a step in the right direction. So what they decided to do was add a recast timer and a casting time to the hoop, but both are really small, 1 second recast and zero point 0.3 seconds casting. You can't spam that, but you can still definitely just weave it into your rotation between casts. I don't want to beat up too much on these devs because they're a pretty small and overworked team, and it might just be a case where the dev who worked on this is new to item design or to EQ in general, but honestly, what the fuck? What a joke. We went through two permakill cycles with almost no communication about it, and two attempts to nerf it, and the end state had no practical impact on the use of the item. Still basically as useful as it was originally, and like I mentioned before, since the in-game currency was so inflated during an earlier issue, no practical effect on the cost to acquire the item either. And what did we get for this extremely minimal impact in an extremely niche item? Disgruntled players due to the lack of communication and wasting their time, the creation of a direct unfairness introduced into the game unnecessarily by leaving the quote unquote broken item in the game for those who had hoarded them to keep using, the wasting of a very limited resource, namely dev time, during not one but two patch cycles on something that shouldn't have even been a priority to begin with after the whole prioritization process was bypassed, and to top it off, another plat dupe introduced into the game. Thankfully, that one was nerfed quickly at least. So, if you're a dev and watched all the way through to this point, yeah, please don't do this sort of stuff. Not only a completely self-inflicted series of wounds, but at best just a horrible use of your own time. All right, good luck out there, everyone.
Not one of you could save me.
Oh,
No.
DI
dude,
fired.
it was so close.